My dear listener, have you ever scrolled through your old messages on your phone and then saw a name that once lit up your world and then had this realization we don't actually talk anymore, but we never really said goodbye either. There was there was no falling out. There was no there's no dramatic ending, just fewer texts and longer silences until one day the friendship was more of a memory than a reality. Today, we're talking about the friendships that fade without closure and, and how to find peace when you're left with more questions than you are answers. Because this kind of a this kind of a loss, the hurt goes deep, doesn't it? Welcome back, my dear listener. I'm glad you're here for a few minutes. This conversation will be vulnerable and tender because we're naming a kind of grief that most people don't really recognize as valid. And as always, I want to remind you I'm not a therapist. I'm a fellow human being who is walking through the complexities of adult friendships alongside you. And here's what I do know. I do know that friendships that fade can hurt just as much as friendships, even more sometimes than friendships that had a clear ending. Because when there's no conversation and there's no closure, we're oftentimes left wondering, did I do something wrong perhaps? Or should I maybe reach out again, right? Or was the friendship ever as real as I thought it was in my experience? This is where integrity and intimacy come in. These are pillars that I highly value in my connections. Integrity for me helps me to stay aligned, even when someone else's silence feels loud. And intimacy helps me see myself clearly, even when someone else no longer does in the same way. So let's talk a little bit about why friendships fade, even though there may not have been any conflict that was discernible. See, friendships fade for so many reasons, right? There's different life stages that we go through. Like, there's new jobs that we may have, or relationships that come and go. There may be geographical moves that we're navigating. Perhaps like the emotional capacity changes over time, right? And what once felt easy now feels like a lot of effort. There may be misaligned values that quietly surface over time. And one person stops reaching out and the other doesn't quite pick up the thread. It's rarely malicious, I would say. It's often just human, right? But knowing that does not stop the pain, does it? Because what you're really grieving isn't just the person. No, what you're grieving is really the version of yourself who felt held and who felt known and chosen in that season that you shared this friendship. So listener, take a deep breath with me while I ask you some questions. Who are you still mourning even though you never officially got the chance to say goodbye? Or where are you waiting for closure that may never come? See, this is where we begin to reclaim our own peace, not by chasing answers that others have, but by telling ourselves truth. See, there's a myth of closure, and it's often very different from what we actually need, I would say. And so we're often taught to believe that closure comes from them, from from a final conversation we had with them, from an explanation that helps it all make sense, right? But but here's the reality. Closure is more of an internal process, not necessarily an external permission slip. So waiting for someone to circle back and give you like the peace that you desire will only keep you tethered to what's already gone. So what does closure look like when no words were spoken? It looks something like this. It looks like acknowledging the ending even if it was silent. You could say something to yourself like, this friendship has faded and I didn't imagine that it would. And it's okay for me to feel the loss of this friendship. See, uh, letting go doesn't necessitate a need to assign blame, because not every drift needs a villain. Sometimes we just grow in different directions, right? Which is legitimate. Grieving what was without rewriting the whole story as painful is a really helpful progression. So you can honor yourself in the good times, even if that connection did not last. See, releasing the version of yourself that keeps hoping that they'll return with answers is another really helpful aspect. You don't need their explanation to necessarily validate your experience. Some practices help us to be able to release that connection without accompanying bitterness, if you will. So here are a few that I find helpful to move through this kind of unspoken ending. Consider maybe like writing a letter that you don't send, where you feel free to pour out like everything you've been feeling, from gratitude to the confusion to the sadness. See, this isn't for them, it's more so for you. It gives your emotions a place to land. Secondly, you could create a small ritual of release, like lighting a candle and looking through old photos one last time perhaps, or archiving the chat thread that you shared with them. You can mark the transition in a tangible way because your heart, it deserves that kind of acknowledgement. Thirdly, you can affirm your own narrative, your own story by saying it out loud. Like you could say something like, I showed up with care. I valued this friendship. It mattered to me, and I'm allowed to move forward. Fourthly, you could notice where hope is keeping you stuck. It's okay for a reconnection someday, perhaps, but don't let that hope keep you from building new, present connections in the meantime. See, finding peace without answers is possible. You, my dear listener, may never know why they stopped reaching out. You may never get the message that said, I'm sorry that I disappeared. And that's difficult, that's hard. But peace does not come from replaying the silence. No, peace comes from choosing your own alignment, choosing to live in integrity with your own values, regardless of how others move. It sounds something like this. It sounds like saying something like, I'll continue to show up fully in my friendships, even knowing that some may not last. Or you could say, I trust myself to grieve endings and still remain open to new beginnings. You could say something also like, I release the need for closure from others because I can offer it to myself, right? No, not every friendship gets a final chapter. Some drift into memory, and that's okay. You don't have to carry bitterness to remember them. You don't have to stay stuck to prove that it mattered. You can let go with softness, with gratitude, and with this quiet confidence that you showed up with your heart. In the next episode that I want to explore, I'll be asking the question, why do you feel lonely even when you have friends that surround you? Because proximity, it doesn't always equal connection, does it? So we'll talk about how to bridge that gap. But dear listener, if today's conversation touched something internally for you, something vulnerable, give yourself some space. Journal your thoughts, reflect a bit, perhaps even share this with someone who's quietly mourning a friendship that faded without saying goodbye. And as always, my dear listener, go gentle, be kind to yourself, because you're doing far better than you think. Bye for now.